I'm going back to Massachusetts. I started a joke which started the whole world.
They said Robin Gibb was caught with classified documents. They said he'd been working with people in government circles. And when airport security opened his bag, they claimed they found something that made everyone stop. For weeks, the tabloids called him unstable, obsessed, and possibly dangerous. Some even whispered that the BG had lost touch with reality, or worse, had something to hide. But none of them knew the truth. Not then. Because what really happened that day at Heathrow Airport wasn't just a celebrity misunderstanding, it was the unraveling of a man who'd already been living on the edge for years, and what they found in Robin's luggage would make headlines for weeks. By the early 1980s, Robin Gibb was no longer the quiet, boyish BG the world remembered from Massachusetts and I Started a Joke. He was eccentric, unpredictable, and surrounded by rumors that never quite died down. He talked about politics, world affairs, and secret meetings with powerful figures in Europe. He'd been seen at embassy events, on flights to Germany, and sometimes traveling alone with briefcases full of documents, some of which he claimed were urgent humanitarian papers. But to others, it sounded strange. Why would a pop singer, one of the richest men in Britain, be involved in anything remotely political? Why would he suddenly surround himself with diplomats, businessmen, and people who didn't seem connected to music at all? Then came the day everything exploded. It was supposed to be a routine trip, just another flight through London's Heathrow Airport. But something about Robin's demeanor caught attention. He was agitated, pacing near security. He had multiple passports, one for work, one for personal travel, and a bag filled with unmarked folders and prescription bottles. Security asked questions. Robin, defensive as ever, said everything was legal. But once they opened the briefcase, rumors began spreading faster than truth ever could. The press caught wind almost immediately. Within hours, headlines screamed, "BG detained, spy claims rock London airport." One paper even suggested Robin was carrying government-level documents. Another claimed he'd been working on a secret project in Berlin. By the next morning, TV stations had already connected it to his earlier erratic interviews, the ones where he'd spoken about being watched and about things the public will never understand. To many, it sounded like the beginning of a breakdown. To others, it sounded like espionage. And then came the twist, one the press never saw coming. Because while they were busy speculating, Robin was sitting quietly in a holding room, insisting that everything he carried was connected to a charitable mission overseas. He wasn't a spy, he wasn't smuggling anything, and he certainly wasn't unstable, at least that's what he said. But even his friends didn't know what to believe anymore. This was the same Robin who'd once refused to sleep because he believed his phone was being tapped. The same Robin who'd once called his bandmates in the middle of the night to talk about encrypted messages hidden in news broadcasts. He was brilliant, no one doubted that, but increasingly unpredictable, and when the customs agents began flipping through the papers in his bag, something changed. Because among the medical prescriptions and handwritten letters, they found references to foreign organizations, financial transfers, and names connected to the Middle East, all of which looked suspicious when taken out of context. It was enough to detain him, enough to make the world wonder what the quietest BG had really been doing overseas. By the end of the day, Robin was released without charges, but the damage was already done. His name was splashed across tabloids, his sanity questioned, his motives twisted into something cinematic, and behind closed doors, his brothers didn't know how to handle it. Barry, the eldest, was furious, not at the press, but at Robin himself. Maurice, always the peacemaker, tried to calm everyone down, but this was different. This wasn't about music or royalties or fame. It was about something darker, something Robin refused to explain fully, even to them. He told one journalist cryptically, "People see what they want to see. I was doing what I believed was right, the rest is none of their business." What did he mean by that? What right was he talking about? And why did he seem so unbothered that the world thought he'd gone mad? Because there was more to this story. A hidden reason why Robin Gibb, one of the world's most famous musicians, was traveling with confidential documents and medication that day. And by the time the truth came out, it would reveal something few people ever knew about him, a side of Robin Gibb that was compassionate, complicated, and caught between two worlds. So stay until the end, because the real reason he was detained will change the way you see Robin Gibb forever. When Robin Gibb walked out of Heathrow Airport that day, he thought it was over. But in truth, it was just beginning. The cameras were already waiting. Flashbulbs exploded like lightning, and every tabloid in London had the same question: what was Robin Gibb hiding? He didn't answer. He just smiled faintly, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, and slipped into a car that sped away. To the press, that silence meant guilt. To his brothers, it meant trouble. And to Robin, it meant one more secret to keep. Within 24 hours, headlines across Britain painted a picture of a fallen idol. Bee Gees airport breakdown. One paper shouted. Singer found with classified files, screamed another. Some claimed he'd been acting erratically for weeks, talking about charitable operations abroad and making strange phone calls in the middle of the night. Others alleged he'd been spotted at diplomatic events he had no reason to attend. The truth was far less dramatic, but nobody wanted the truth. Robin was an easy target. He was brilliant but mercurial, wealthy but isolated, and after years of creative tension within the Bee Gees, the press knew one thing for sure: Robin was the unpredictable one. Inside the Gibb family, panic spread. Barry was livid. He called reporters vultures, but even he couldn't hide his frustration. He told friends Robin was making things harder than they needed to be. Maurice tried to keep peace, telling everyone that Robin was just going through one of his phases. But there was something different about this. This wasn't the eccentric Robin who stayed up all night writing songs about ghosts and politics. This was a man carrying official-looking papers, traveling alone under stress, and refusing to explain why. Even his wife at the time, Duina, later hinted that he'd been involved in sensitive causes abroad, causes that weren't always understood by outsiders. She said he had a big heart, but sometimes it got him into dangerous situations. The public, meanwhile, was merciless. Talk shows joked about Spy Gibb. Radio hosts read mock telegrams on air, pretending Robin was working for MI6. And for a brief moment, even serious journalists wondered whether there was more to the story, if this soft-spoken man with the haunting voice had somehow wandered into something far beyond his control. Behind the jokes, though, there was concern, because this wasn't the first time Robin's behavior had raised questions. In the late 70s, he'd once told an interviewer that he believed certain governments were interested in the Bee Gees' political views, that their influence reached further than music. It sounded bizarre, even paranoid, but he insisted he wasn't imagining it. He had been reading about world hunger, war relief, and economic inequality, and unlike most pop stars, he wanted to do something. That mission, he said later, led him to people with connections in charity, government, and business, people who could get things done. But those same connections would soon cast a shadow over his name. At the airport, investigators had indeed found documents tied to foreign contacts, names, donations, bank records. Robin said they were for charity. The tabloids said they were proof of espionage, and the Bee Gees management, terrified of a scandal, told everyone to stay quiet. For the first time in years, the brothers stopped doing interviews together. Barry and Maurice retreated to Miami. Robin stayed in England, trying to rebuild his image, but the rumors wouldn't die. Every time he stepped out in public, someone shouted, "Hey Robin, who are you spying for?" He laughed it off, but behind the smile he was breaking. Friends described him as restless. He'd spend hours on the phone, pacing, muttering about things people didn't understand. He talked about charity convoys, foreign aid, and humanitarian work. He wanted to help people, but even those closest to him admitted they weren't sure who he was helping or why. And then came another twist. A private letter leaked to the press. It was from one of Robin's charity contacts overseas, thanking him for his support and sensitive relief efforts. The media tore it apart, claiming it proved he was involved in something secret. Robin's lawyers denied everything. They said it was a philanthropic misunderstanding, but the damage was irreversible. By 1983, the incident had become part of the Robin Gibb myth, the story of the eccentric Bee Gee who dabbled in mystery. He hated it, but he didn't fight it. Instead, he disappeared from the spotlight, spending months away from the stage, alone in his mansion, writing songs that few people ever heard. Those who visited him said he was polite, gentle, but different. He seemed to live between two realities, the world of music and the world inside his mind, full of secret missions, hidden messages, and endless guilt. One friend later said, Robin carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He wanted to save everyone, and he couldn't save himself. And yet something about his calmness bothered people. He never once seemed angry about the false accusations. He just said quietly, They'll know the truth someday. What truth? What could possibly explain a pop star being detained at an airport with confidential files and prescription drugs? He wouldn't say, not then. But years later, when the truth finally came out, it painted a picture of Robin that no one, not even his family, had fully understood. A picture of a man trying to do good, while the world thought he'd gone mad. And the real reason he was detained that day, it wasn't crime, it wasn't espionage, it was something far more human and far more heartbreaking. But to understand it, you have to go back to the beginning, to the real cause Robin was secretly supporting, one that had nothing to do with governments or spies. It was about compassion and guilt, and a promise he made long before the world ever heard the name Bee Gees. For years, the story of Robin Gibb's airport detention floated through pop culture like a ghost, whispered, exaggerated, and twisted into something almost mythic. But the truth? It was never about espionage. It was about mercy, because what Robin carried that day wasn't classified. It was personal. When the investigation was quietly dropped, the documents returned, and no charges were filed, most of the world moved on. But a few reporters, the ones who still believed there was more, started digging. And that's when they found something buried in the noise. Robin had recently been in touch with several European charities, including one working in war-torn regions to deliver aid to displaced families. He wasn't hiding government secrets. He was carrying donation records and correspondence with aid coordinators, people who relied on his help and on his discretion. One associate, who spoke years later under anonymity, said Robin wasn't doing anything illegal. He was just trying to help people in places most celebrities never even think about. It wasn't the kind of charity that made headlines. No photo ops, no red carpets. These were grassroots missions that involved quiet transfers, personal letters, and sometimes, as in Robin's case, flying out himself to meet organizers. But he didn't tell anyone, not his brothers, not his team, because he didn't want it to be seen as publicity, or worse, as something political. That secrecy, however, became his undoing. The prescription drugs found in his bag were antidepressants and sleep medication prescribed after years of pressure, touring, and emotional strain. To customs officers, a mix of unmarked pills and unsealed bottles looked suspicious. To the tabloids, it looked scandalous. And to Robin, it was humiliating. He once said in an interview years later, "You try to do good quietly, and somehow it turns into madness in the papers." But that's life. Truth never sells as well as rumor. Still, something about the way he handled it all made the story even more compelling. He never released a formal statement, never sued for defamation, never demanded retractions. Instead, he withdrew into himself as though silence was the only way to protect what mattered. In one of his later diaries, he wrote about that time with haunting honesty. "People saw me as paranoid. Maybe I was. But when you see how fast a rumor can erase a lifetime of work, you start guarding the little truth you have left." He knew he couldn't fight the press. He'd lived through fame's ugliest side, the gossip, the invasions, the endless appetite for scandal, so he let them think what they wanted. Behind closed doors, however, those closest to him saw the toll. Robin had always been a sensitive soul, deeply emotional, drawn to melancholy and mystery. He'd written some of the Bee Gees' most haunting songs, and every one of them came from that same well of vulnerability. Now that same heart was breaking under the weight of public misunderstanding. His mother, Barbara Gibb, once said, "Robin was always the dreamer. Barry had the drive, Maurice had the balance, Robin had the soul." And sometimes, that made life harder for him. He stopped traveling for months. When he finally reappeared, it was at a small charity dinner in London, the very kind of cause he'd been supporting all along. There were no headlines this time, no flashing cameras, just quiet applause as he donated anonymously under someone else's name. To him, that was redemption. But to those who knew him best, it was more than that. It was proof of who he really was, a man who wanted to help, even when the world misjudged his every move. Still, the question lingered. Why was he so secretive? Why not explain it all and clear his name once and for all? The answer came years later, in one rare interview, when he finally spoke about the incident, not in anger, but with a hint of sadness. He said softly, "When you work with people who are vulnerable, in war zones, in poor places, you can't just go around shouting their names in public. They trusted me. I wasn't about to betray that for the sake of headlines." That was Robin, the man behind the mystery. It wasn't about hiding guilt. It was about protecting trust. In truth, he'd been donating and coordinating efforts for displaced children through a European relief group, helping relocate families during conflicts that barely made the news at the time. The confidential files in his bag were nothing more than names, donation amounts, and correspondence between organizers. But because those papers mentioned foreign governments and financial transfers, customs officials flagged them as potential security risks. A single misunderstanding, multiplied by tabloid sensationalism, turned a humanitarian act into a headline scandal, and yet if you asked Robin whether he regretted it, he'd simply say no. He once told a friend, "If you care about people, you can't pick and choose the easy way. Sometimes compassion looks strange to those who've never felt it." Those words summed up his entire life. A man of contradictions, gentle and guarded, brilliant and unpredictable, who lived in a world that never quite knew what to make of him. But even after the truth surfaced, the damage to his reputation lingered. Years later, journalists would still bring up the airport incident as shorthand for his eccentricity. He never corrected them. Maybe because, deep down, he knew the truth no longer mattered. What mattered was what he did with it. And that, as we'll see, became one of the most emotional transformations of his entire life. Because the man who once stood accused of espionage would soon dedicate himself to something that proved exactly who he was all along. Not a spy, not a scandal, but a soul trying to heal the world. One song, one cause, and one quiet act of kindness at a time. In the years that followed, the headlines faded, but the memory of that day, the flashing cameras, the endless questions, the sting of humiliation, never left Robin Gibb. He rarely spoke about it, but when he did, there was no anger in his voice, only disappointment, not in others, but in himself, for letting the world misunderstand him so completely. He had always believed that fame was a fragile thing, that one bad headline could erase years of truth, and after the airport scandal, he learned just how fragile reputation could be. Still, instead of retreating from the world entirely, Robin chose a quieter kind of redemption. He began working more closely with charities, helping disaster victims, cancer patients, and refugee programs, but this time, anonymously, without fanfare or press releases. He told one interviewer years later, "You don't help people to be seen helping them. You help because you've been helped yourself, in one way or another." That single line said everything, because deep down, Robin knew what it felt like to be misunderstood, to be painted as something he wasn't. He'd seen his generosity twisted into suspicion, his eccentricity labeled as madness, but he also knew that you can't control what the world believes about you. You can only keep doing good quietly, and so that's what he did. He worked on causes that no one would ever associate with his name: children's hospitals, cultural preservation, post-war rebuilding. He lent his voice to advocacy projects, donated royalties to humanitarian groups, and kept in touch with people who had once written him desperate letters asking for help. He never forgot any of them. Those close to him noticed a change. He became more reflective, more spiritual, and somehow more at peace. His wife, Duina, said years later that he'd learned to see purpose in pain, that the airport incident, as cruel as it had been, had forced him to re-examine what truly mattered: not fame, not perception, but compassion and privacy. He began journaling, writing long letters he never sent, and composing songs that spoke of redemption and misunderstanding, songs that echoed the themes he'd been living all along. One of those songs, written quietly in his home studio, carried a line that would later feel prophetic: "The world won't always understand the ones who love it most." That was Robin, the dreamer, the empath, the misunderstood poet. And as years went on, the world began to see that too. The same press that once mocked him for secret documents and spy games now praised him for his humanitarian efforts and timeless songwriting, but Robin never gloated. He just smiled, almost shyly, and said, "It all comes around eventually." When asked near the end of his life whether he ever forgave the media for what they did to him, he paused for a long time before answering. Finally, he said, "They were doing their job. I was doing mine. I just wish they had seen what I was really trying to do." That quiet grace defined him, because for all his brilliance and ego and eccentricity, Robin never became bitter. He turned his pain into something generous, a life spent helping quietly, writing deeply, and forgiving freely. And perhaps the greatest irony of all is this, that the very incident meant to destroy his reputation became proof of his humanity, because when people finally learned the truth, that he'd been helping charities abroad, not hiding secrets, they saw him differently. Not as the mysterious BG lost in his own world, but as a man with a conscience bigger than his fame. Barry later said in an interview, "Robin was always different. He felt everything more. The music, the world, the pain, it all lived inside him." Maurice once joked that Robin could cry over a headline in a newspaper or a child he'd never met. That was his nature. And that nature, as misunderstood as it was, is what made him Robin Gibb. Even toward the end, he spoke softly about that chapter. Not with shame, but with a kind of wistful understanding. He said, "It's strange how one day can define you, but I suppose it's up to you whether it defines your end or your beginning." For Robin, it was a beginning. The moment the world's cruelty pushed him deeper into kindness, the day suspicion turned into compassion, and the day misunderstanding became his greatest teacher. In the end, Robin Gibb wasn't the man the tabloids described. He wasn't a spy, he wasn't unstable, he wasn't lost. He was a dreamer, one who carried the weight of a world he couldn't fix, but tried to help anyway. A man who learned that doing the right thing quietly will always echo louder than defending yourself loudly. And maybe that's why his music still moves people, because it came from a heart that refused to harden, no matter how misunderstood it became. So the next time you hear "I started a joke," remember that it wasn't just a song about irony or pain. It was a reflection of the man himself, someone who lived with empathy, carried secrets of kindness, and proved that truth doesn't need to shout to last forever. Because for Robin Gibb, the world may have laughed once, but in the end, it was his silence that told the real story. If this story moved you, subscribe to RetroWaves, where we uncover the hidden truths behind music's most misunderstood legends, because sometimes the quietest voices leave the loudest echoes.